Okay, thank you. Good morning and good evening to all speakers and participants. Welcome to the webinar Ecolinguistics, Media Ecology, and the Anthropomorphic Profile of War in Socio and Psycholinguistic Dimensions. It's the fifth webinar held within ecolinguistic modes of Ukrainian discursive space in the European multicultural continuum project funded by the National Research Foundation of Ukraine. The grantee is Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv. The previous webinars held within the framework of the project considered the topics of ecolinguistics in Ukraine, modes and vectors, computer modeling of language and culture, ecosystems, ecolinguistic modes of present-day advertising discourse, media ecology and language innovations. You can learn about the webinars on the project website, Ecolinguistic Project UA, Facebook account and YouTube channel. We're very glad to welcome our key speaker, Lance Strate, a leading scholar in media ecology and media communication at Fordham University, New York City, the president of the Institute of General Semantics and the founder of the Media Ecology Association. So now let me hand over to Professor Olena Matrinska.
Thank you very much. First of all, I highly appreciate this opportunity, Lance, that you've joined us with this wonderful talk, Ecolinguistics and Media Ecology. And as it has been mentioned, Lance Strate is our keynote speaker, and he is the author of 8 books, including Media Ecology, an approach to understanding the human condition. I think it is already a bestseller. And actually, I think that it will be the best right now just to ask Lance to start his talk. So you have the words. Thank you very much, Lance.
Well, thank you, Elena. And it's always a question when someone says you're a wonderful talk before you've given it. I think you should withhold judgment until we're done. But I'm happy to be with you in this virtual way, and I do want to thank Elena and Igor and all of you for this opportunity to talk about things that I find interesting. Whether you find them interesting will, I'll also withhold judgment. I do recognize that this is a difficult time for Ukraine, and I just want to recognize that and wish all the best for your nation and for President Zelensky, at this time. We are, certainly hearing a lot about it in the news here in the United States. I want for what that's worth. Anyway, to get started, I guess I have permission to do the share screen, it looks like. I personally, as a media ecologist, I'm not in love with PowerPoint, but I recognize its usefulness under these conditions. Now, let me just, I think it works. Okay, you can all see this, it's okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. So I, at being asked to provide a title, I gave you Ecolinguistics and Media Ecology. But first, let me start out by saying that, of course, you all are the experts in linguistics and ecolinguistics. So I want to recognize that. I do want to note, as was noted in my introduction, 2 organizations, the Media Ecology Association, which we started back in 1998, and it puts out a quarterly journal, Explorations in Media Ecology. The MEA holds an annual convention in the early summer, usually in June, but this year it's going to be in July, being hosted this year by a university in Rio, in Brazil. There is a call for papers out, and we certainly invite you, would be happy to have you join us. You know, obviously there are a lot of concerns about traveling at this moment, but you know, we are all hoping for the best as far as that's concerned. And who knows, maybe one of these years we could, you might be interested in hosting our annual meeting. As was also mentioned, I am the current president for the Institute of General Semantics, which was started back in 1938 by a Polish immigrant, Alfred Korzybski. We put out a quarterly journal, etc., a review of general semantics, and I think there might be possibilities for collaboration there as well. We also hold one major annual event in October in New York City that includes the Alfred Korzybski Memorial Lecture and then a seminar that follows. And if you ever,
я не могу иногда сразу отвечать, ну типа звонят с министерства.
if you're ever interested in coming to New York, you know, at that time, I'd be happy to have you participate. Okay, so both of these organizations have membership, and you know, invite you to become members of them. Okay, so we'll start by going into common ground. And I recognize that we're speaking, you know, I'm using my language, not yours. And I'm a typical stupid American who only knows one language. So I'm, you know, always very impressed by folks who know many others. And but if there is anything at any point that I say something that's not clear or I'm talking too fast, New Yorkers are known particularly for talking very fast compared to other parts of the US, although I think as an academic, I tend to be on the slow side. But anyway, please let me know. And again, of course, you all know much more about the subject of language than I do, but I'll explain a bit about our understanding of what that's about without going into much of the technicalities, but simply, you know, the primary point that language is the defining trait of humanity, of the human species, you know, that there is no population, no tribe somewhere that doesn't have language, and that is what makes us human. You know, that is what defines us and has been the key to our survival. And one of the factors of language, and this was the starting point for Korzybski in formulating general semantics, he coined the term time binding, with the idea that language allows us to pass knowledge on through generations, so that unlike other forms of life that pretty much live the same way that they've been living for centuries, human beings are able to make progress over time, to accumulate knowledge and make progress. So that was a starting point for him, you know, the connection between language and progress, which involves the ability to store and pass on knowledge, but also to evaluate it and to decide what works and what doesn't work. What ideas or information should we disregard? A second point about language, and this is something that's emphasized by one of our key media ecology theorists, Walter Ong, is that language is speech. That it is entirely to be understood as an acoustic phenomenon, and that there is no, say, again, no tribe somewhere like out in the Amazon that doesn't have speech, as that only does, say, sign language, for example. So understanding that, one of the faults, if you like, of some aspects of linguistics was to turn language into something that's written down and look at it only in those terms. And Ong's starting point is to understand that it is speech, and speech is ephemeral. As we speak, the words vanish into thin air, and we depend on memory, and that's how we functioned for tens of thousands of years, which also suggests that when writing is introduced, it is probably the most significant change in human history. So a lot of attention is brought to that. Ong referred to that as the technologizing of the word. As we add technologies to language to further amplify its possibilities. Korzybski didn't make much of it, but really, and there was at least a passing acknowledgement that time binding was not, it kind of really took off in a major way after writing, because that allowed us to store knowledge in ways that wasn't possible with just speech. Of course, a very basic idea is that language is a form of symbolic communication. And that gets into my sort of home field of communication studies. Very basic idea, but that sort of leads into some of the studies that you're no doubt, some of the work that you're no doubt familiar with semiotics and others, I.A. Richards and the meaning of meaning. Even Pavlov had something to say about the idea of symbols. So what this also points out is that language is the primary form of symbolic communication, but there are other forms as well that we should be aware of and pay attention to. This was very important for in the philosophy of language for Suzanne Langer, a major scholar in our tradition, who wrote about that even perception is a form of symbolic work. And of course, that images, music, art, and these are even myth, ritual, these are other aspects of symbolic communication. So just to put it into a larger context of symbolic communication. And that is actually, the point that language exists in not in isolation, but works with perception. At least sometimes we take issue with some of the work in kind of continental cultural studies that seems to suggest that language is a closed system and that all meaning is generated within language, for example, by binary oppositions, as opposed to there being something outside of language that we work with, which would be perception. That our sense perception, is influenced by our language, the language we speak, but also goes beyond that, so that we have recourse to something more. In general semantics, and the shift was, or the emphasis was on empiricism, on the scientific approach, induction, empiricism, as opposed to a deductive and Cartesian kind of approach to to this understanding. At least one of the things that happened, it seems, in scholarship in various fields, at least from where I stand, was that there was a lot of emphasis in the mid-20th century about perception and sort of like opening up the senses and getting past language to just pure perception. And it involved some of that experimentation with psychedelic drugs that the 60s were famous for. It involves some of that embrace of Eastern mysticism, Zen and all of that. But there was this, at least this interesting idea to try to get at perception. And as you get to the late 20th century and beyond, that seemed to have gotten lost with, again, the emphasis on language as purely existing in a closed way, not connecting to the outside world. So for general semantics, there's the idea of getting closer to reality through by avoiding some of the problems with language. In media ecology, there's the idea that to look at perception differences between different sense organs, between vision and hearing, for example, and how that affects our thinking, and looking at technologies in part as being about language, in part as being about extensions of sense organs as well, and influencing the way that we use our sensory organs. So just to bring that up, but that is that point that at least in some aspects of the study of language, it seems like some of the interest in reference got pushed aside in favor of, like if we take Saussure and signifier versus signified, that becomes the whole interest as opposed to being interested in reference. And that requires some, acknowledgement of what is the reality out there. What do we know about the world? A lot of people in media ecology who are purely coming from a phenomenological background, but in another kind of tradition, it is sort of understanding ideas from physics to, just sort of ground our understanding of the world and how we're relating to it. But the big thing then is, what is the relationship between language and thought? And that is, I would imagine, is an area that's familiar to you. It's very familiar to you. And it's certainly the idea that language is what we think with. That not all of what we call thought is linguistic. And so if we look at thought, perception could be counted as thought. We can also sort of visualize internally something that we're not looking at. You hear music in your head, we can play back a memory. So it's not the entirety of thought, but that a large portion of thought is talking to yourself silently. That is, we're using language to think. And by the way, that is speech, right? We don't think by imagining ourselves writing something out or reading a document. We talk to ourselves in our head as a kind of inner voice. So that is thought. I don't know if you've seen it, because this was something on YouTube. It was coming up in the English language, but there were actually some videos about individuals who are perfectly, ordinary, even intelligent, like college students who are saying, well, I don't have that. I don't talk to myself all the time. in my head, and that must be horrible. So at least some of these ideas require modification, but we do, it's been alternately referred to as an internal monologue or internal dialogue, that makes up much of thought and especially higher mental processes. And this also has been referred to as intrapersonal versus interpersonal communication, and with the idea that we start out learning language externally by speaking it, by interacting, and then we internalize it. We bring it inside ourselves, internalize speech as thought. So that's a very important part of our development, is when we take external behavior and bring it internally into a kind of form of cognition. And I note that it's similar to learning how to read, because when you learn how to read, you first learn how to speak it out loud, and it's actually a secondary skill to learn how to read silently. When you look at it historically in the Confessions of Augustine, and he is surprised to find a person who is able to read silently. He didn't even think that such a thing was possible. And it doesn't become a commonplace until after the printing revolution in early modern Europe. And the process of internalization also applies to role behavior. There's another area that we sort of incorporate, symbolic interaction. Folks like George Herbert Mead and Irving Goffman, and the idea that we learn roles, and we do that by behavior, by imitation, but also we put on the role, we adopt it, and then it becomes our sense of self. Just the process of internalization is very key. But this leads to the important point that if we think in language, then the language that we use gives us a particular way of thinking. So different languages give us different ways of thinking, different kinds of thought. And that is really a kind of foundational point that that leads into linguistic relativism, which is an approach in linguistics that Chomsky kind of knocked out of serious consideration for a long time, but is very, very significant for both general semantics as a kind of parallel approach, and for media ecology. It's not to totally dismiss Chomsky. It's clear that language has a biological foundation, but the argument that differences between different languages are insignificant is totally unsupported. So instead, we take the view that differences are significant. So I think it was the 18th century, Wilhelm von Humboldt is sometimes pointed to as one of the early philosophers who expressed this point of view, but it's best known through Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf. I think Sapir may have been Canadian, I'm not sure, I can't recall now, and Whorf was American. Sapir was a very highly respected linguistics scholar in the early 20th century. Whorf was his student. He didn't become an academic, but he did his PhD under Sapir, researching Native American languages. Whorf was an insurance claims adjuster, but he got into some interesting stuff, and it became known in many quarters as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and I would assume that you're familiar with it. I was very pleased to see, if you know the science fiction movie Arrival, it gets mentioned in there. It's worth mentioning that, and Sapir and Whorf, I mean, they're coming from linguistic anthropology. And another anthropologist in the same mold was Dorothy Lee. And she often gets forgotten. And she didn't do as much work, I mean, but she published a couple of books. Some say that she was even more of a relativist than Sapir and Whorf. So I do want to mention her, and she did have a big influence on some of the early media ecology scholarship from Edmund Carpenter and Marshall McLuhan. But the basic idea is that that language affects or determines the way we view the world. So different languages have different worldviews. And again, that language could be understood as tools for thought. They're what we think with. And so they provide different worldviews. The most obvious evidence for this that you would know, because you're all, I believe you're all at least bilingual, and if you're just listening to me, you are, is the fact that when you learn another language, when the point where you achieve some level of fluency is the point when you think in the other language. You can't just go back and forth and back and forth. You have to think in the other language. It's like you put the other language on and wear it. That really speaks to the idea that we have to understand that it's a different worldview and a different set of tools. So, and what comes from this is that every language is unique, valuable, and irreplaceable. So it's nothing short than a tragedy and often unacknowledged tragedy that languages disappear all the time. And of course, this has more to do with, say, tribal languages, languages from cultures that don't have writing and aren't being recorded. And when the last speaker disappears, that's it. But from this point of view, it is an important understanding that, and again, as opposed to the sort of Chomsky view that different languages are insignificant because it's all the same in its deep structure. Here it's no, the differences are significant and worthy of study and worthy of preserving. So we're talking about, and if this is Gregory Bateson's famous phrase, differences that make a difference. Differences count. Languages do change and evolve over time. They're not static. And most of the time, the change is organic. It comes from the bottom up, but languages can be modified. You start to think of them as tools, they're modifiable. So there can be purposeful change that's implemented to language. George Orwell in 1984 is famous for applying linguistic relativism with the idea that in a totalitarian society, the one he imagined, you could change the meaning of words, create new words, and especially eliminate words to try to control how people think. And others have looked at this because it didn't come out of nowhere, but in fact, in Nazi Germany and under Soviet communism, I mean, they issued new dictionaries and did try to make changes to the language, to the German and Russian and other languages. but it's also very apparent here in the US and in other parts of the world where the idea of sexism in language, and I think, you know, we might can consider that, you know, generally a positive development, but that this was a conscious effort to eliminate uses of language that are considered to, you know, communicate in some ways, reinforce, if not actually teach inequality in language. So again, I mean, this can be done, right? That there can be purposeful change in language, and general semantics as a kind of, I wouldn't quite call a movement, but part of its approach is the idea that we should be more thoughtful in our use of language and more careful about it. So and I won't go into all of what it's about, but you know, that it also represented an effort to change the way that people use language, but with the idea to improve people's ability to think rationally and clearly. And you could say all of education is about that. You know that education is about learning how to use language in new ways, improving your vocabulary, but you're learning how to express yourself in better ways, presumably. So this brings us to media. We're going to talk about media ecology, and the idea that is not universally accepted, but is central to media ecology, is that language is a medium. And you know, that language is a medium just like writing or printing or television or Zoom is a medium, is a means or method or mode of communication, of expression. It also allows us to say that different languages are different media. You know, they're different levels. In the same way we could say that, say, printing, you know, print media, you know, printing is a medium, but newspapers are different from magazines, or different from books. They are different media. So different languages are different media, and media, by the same token, turning it around, media are languages. Every medium is the equivalent of a language. You could trace that all the way back to Sergei Eisenstein, who argued that film is a language. And that was, if you're familiar with his theory of montage, you know, which was tied up with communism, but you know, if you apart from the ideological aspect of it, which you may or may not favor, the basic idea that there's a vocabulary, the individual shots that a filmmaker is creating, and there's a grammar. The way the shots are edited together is the basis of the grammar. But in a much broader sense than for Marshall McLuhan and Edmund Carpenter brought in this idea of languages are media, media are languages, that you can, you know, really combine them under the heading of media. Carpenter expressed this when he referred to, this is in the 50s, you know, he called it the new languages, you know, referring to the mass media of that time. And McLuhan started out looking at grammar, not in the modern sense, but in the traditional sense of the trivium, you know, going back to antiquity, the idea, which is, I notice a number of you are identified as with philology, which is something we don't have much of. We don't use that term much in the US. I know in Britain they use that. And grammar is the basis of philology, study of language and literature. And McLuhan had actually, you know, very interesting argument about this, that the trivium, this is grammar, rhetoric, and logic, dates back to antiquity, that Western intellectual history could be seen as a war or quarrel, among the aspects of the trivium. Of course, Plato, Aristotle were on the side of logic, but that grammar, the grammarians who were all about reading and interpreting, were the basis of modern science. That science comes from the idea of it comes from a religious background, that God created two books, nature and scripture. And it's our obligation to be reading both books. So that, say, Francis Bacon, coming at this, was a grammarian, not, that it wasn't from logic that science developed, but an empirical view comes from reading and the extension of reading beyond, written work. In any event, so he identified media ecology, what we call media ecology, as a grammarian kind of approach. But what would come from that is, of course, that every medium has its own worldview that it brings to the table. Every medium gives us tools for thought, right? That we think in video now, for example. And of course, that the different media interact. In regard to languages, it is that, of course, that writing changed languages. So did printing, and so did radio. Radio revived much of spoken language, especially for languages that were almost gone, like Gaelic in Ireland and Scotland, were revived by radio. And of course, the internet, a great boon to especially indigenous languages. Anyway, beyond that, in media ecology, particularly McLuhan equates technology and medium. Any technology is a medium. Any technology, tool, machine, device is a way that we mediate with the world. So we can now create a further equation that a technology as a medium is also a language. He has a quote in Understanding Media about, I forgot who it was from, but it was about Napoleon understood the grammar of gunpowder. And if we think about grammar as structure and rules, it can apply to any technology. I think about learning how to drive the automobile, and there's a point where you really just become the car, where when you first start to learn how to drive, there's you, and then there's the car, and you're not the same thing, and nothing feels right. It doesn't turn the way you think it should. Distances are too close, whatever. And then after a while, you learn how to drive, and it's like a switch flips on, and you are the car. You've put on the car. You've become the car. But it's also that you're fluent in car. You're fluent in automobile at that point. So we can think of language as a technology in the same way. Just because it has a biological basis, all technology does. I like to say, we talk about the opposable thumb as the basis of tool use, and we have opposable tongues, as well for speaking. Everything is biological. If it wasn't, we wouldn't be able to use it. So bringing these things together, we understand that language can be influenced. It is an invention. It is a creation. It's a tool. We also can look at other things like how technology becomes a metaphor. For example, the steam engine was the big metaphor of the industrial age. If you want to understand Marxism, You know, what was Karl Marx about? He was thinking society is a steam engine. And what happens with a steam engine, if there's too much pressure that builds up, it explodes. And obviously that metaphor wasn't quite right. You know, didn't fit. The same thing, Sigmund Freud. The mind is a steam engine. And we all our vocabulary. We say we're under pressure. We say if somebody can't take it anymore, they explode. We say that to relieve the pressure, you have to let off steam. I assume you have some of these phrases in Ukrainian as well. We even have images, like cartoon images of steam coming out of somebody's ears when they're angry. And it all comes from that metaphor. Yeah, we have the older metaphors. The universe is like a clockwork. We call the heart a ticker. So technology is a basis of metaphor. Language, as I said, functions as a tool, a technology. By the way, technology is more than human. This is another point, that it's not just about human beings. This is where people say language can't be a technology because it's artificial. Well, animals have technologies, and some of the most intricate examples, think about birds building nests. You know, for an extreme example of animal technology. So it really is connected to biology. It's not like a hard and fast separation, but it is a linkage. And biology itself can be understood as a medium. Not everyone would accept that, but we understand the body as a medium, the sense organs as a medium as well. So for media ecology, we have Marshall McLuhan's famous phrase, the medium is the message. The idea being that we should pay attention to the medium, that we shouldn't be distracted by the content. Not that the content is insignificant, but the medium has the greater effect. You know, in the same way that language is a medium, it's less significant what people say to each other than the actual characteristics of language, which define, influence, and restrict what people can or cannot say. That medium influences then what we can communicate, the content. It influences the individual, because again, we internalize the medium. It affects the way the media that we use affect the way that we think and feel and perceive, and affects society and culture, how we organize ourselves, kind of culture that we have. That idea in media ecology also introduces the idea that changing, adding a new medium or a new technology doesn't just result in the way things were with just that one addition. It leads to systemic change, meaning that if you introduce something, we introduce smartphones, we introduce the internet, we introduce television, we introduce the alphabet, all along the line, you change not just one thing, but that changes other things, and that changes other things. And we wind up with a different system on account of that. And this has a kind of historical theory to it. So in the way that language and speech, it defines the human species, and it's through notation and the ability to keep track of things, especially that we see the beginnings of what we used to call civilization, that is settlements, people living in a more complex form of organization, and what we call cities, urban life. And that's strongly connected to writing. And then the invention of the alphabet is the defining factor that gives Western culture its its character. And the two, the first alphabet among the Semitic peoples in the Middle East gives rise to the religious tradition of the West, right? Judaism, Christianity, also Islam, and it gives rise to all three. It gives rise to the idea of law, written, codified law, and of history, of written history. And then as it's brought over to Greece, to ancient Greece, and there we get secular history, philosophy and science, democracy, theater, and with that, the idea of rhetoric, the ancestor of literary studies and language studies, grammar. So what the alphabet is the defining feature of Western civilization. And then typography, Johann Gutenberg's the invention he's credited with brings in the modern world. 1450, thereabout, 1439, 1450s. At that moment, Europe is not the leading light in the world. It's a backwater. But from that point on, Europe, the West, takes off and leaves the rest of the world behind with the development of science and technology. It also is connected to religious changes in Western Europe, the Protestant Reformation as a major factor. And then electronics, starting in the 19th century with the telegraph, and particularly becoming particularly powerful with television after World War II, and it has created a new kind of culture. And with the further development of computers, the internet, digital technology, mobile technology, we continue to change and alter ourselves and our way of life, our societies and culture. This, of course, ecology is something that media ecology and ecolinguistics has in common. So to note that going back to general semantics, Alfred Korzybski referred to the neurolinguistic and neurosemantic environment, and another general semanticist, Wendell Johnson, just shortened it to the idea of the semantic environment. But the idea is that language, symbols are not just tools that we use, but they are an environment. We live in them. If they're the way you view the world, then they, in effect, are your environment. Marshall McLuhan also referred to the media environment, that media create environments. When you think about, none of you are out in nature, so you are in humanly, artificially created environments. We're all on Zoom. The very way that we refer to it as being on Zoom is to talk of it as an environment. When I signed on, I said, oh, you're here, right? And we speak of it as a place. Neil Postman, who coined the term media ecology, used many of these phrases: semantic environment, information environment, media environment. And we can trace back some of these usages. Patrick Geddes, a Scottish scholar, and then the folks at the University of Chicago School of Sociology use the term human ecology. Lewis Mumford, very significant for media ecology, one of the great intellectuals of the 20th century, and a founder of urban studies, referred to the ecology of culture, and also an ecology of technics or technology. And of course, systems theory, which is a whole other area, but that is a significant area for media ecology, for understanding the idea of ecology, of systems and environments. So when we get to media ecology, a couple of points here. And Neil Postman was my professor, so, but Postman, along with his co-author, Charlie Weingartner, in a popular book from 1969, I believe, Teaching as a Subversive Activity, came out with this. We took the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis and stretched it out. So he put forth the Sapir-Whorf-Korzybski Ames. That's Adalbert Ames, who wrote about perception. And of course, Einstein and Heisenberg, familiar names from the 20th century revolution in physics. Wittgenstein from the philosophy of language, and McLuhan. So et al. For, to note that there are lots more. A hypothesis that language is not merely a vehicle of expression, it's also the driver, and that what we perceive and therefore can learn is a function of our languaging processes. Right? So that's for Postman. And McLuhan was much more about sense perception as the primary focus. Postman came out of more of, his background was in English education, and so much more of a language-based approach. And circa 1968, and which was published in a piece in 1970, the Reformed English Curriculum, he put forth he coined the phrase media ecology and defined it as the study of media as environments. And in fact, medium and environment are synonyms, but they're not usually acknowledged to be synonyms. So just the point that I think it's a very useful definition. Let's think of media, and again, that includes language, technology as environments that we live in. Which I've made the point that we can reverse it as well and talk about the study of environments as media. So a situation, a context, also a system can be understood as a medium, in the sense that, say, a classroom, a physical classroom is a medium of communication. A church is a medium of communication. A city street is a medium of communication, a city itself. So all of these things can be studied because they're all about the environment that we live in and how that influences the way that we think and speak and so forth. Last point I bring in, this is my own work of bringing in Hannah Arendt, the philosopher. She talks about 3 types of human activity, and it could correspond to 3 aspects of the human condition, which is also the environment that we live in, which is also the media that we exist in. And I've adapted it, I've changed it. It's not exactly what she refers to. And she referred to labor, work, and action. And I adapted it that we exist in 3 general types of environments: the biophysical, the technological, and the symbolic. Biophysical is what the scientists refer to. We're governed by the laws of physics and by our own biology. The technological is how we change and act on the biophysical. And of course, the symbolic includes language and other codes and symbol systems. And I don't know if you can see this. I created a model for this, and with the idea that I can't move my thing. Okay, that and this appears in my book on media ecology. I created a kind of diagram for it with the idea that there is the large biophysical environment, what most people refer to as the environment. Within it is the technological environment, the way that we've modified it. And within it is the symbolic environment, the way that we use language and symbols. And I made this an internally tangent set of, rather than concentric circles, because they all intersect. Symbolic is obviously a function of the biophysical environment, and so all three interact in that respect. So that was just a way to try to visualize what I'm referring to here. That's the end of my presentation. I'm sorry for taking up so much time, and I know it was a bit long, but I hope that's in some way useful for your work. I'd be happy to take any questions or criticisms or condemnations that you might have.
Thank you very much for this talk. Now we can definitely say for this wonderful talk, theoretically grounded and philosophical in some way. And now I see that there are lots of questions afterwards. Elena Marina, our speaker and a professor, head of Markovsky Department of English Philology, as we use it here in Ukraine, philology.
Yeah, thank you, Elena. And Lance, thanks a lot for your thought-provoking talk. And actually, I would say that to some extent, it's really a conceptual breakthrough for me, particularly. I can say generally that I'm kind of prepared for your today's talk because I've watched a number of your presentations, conference talks on YouTube. So I enjoyed them a lot as well. So, and actually I have a lot of questions really, but of course I'll ask just one or two if you don't mind.
Sure.
So the first question concerns actually, yeah, thank you, concerns actually two notions. Yes, the notion of mode and the notion of medium. So actually you have mentioned that language is a medium, right? And so a lot of other resources are media. And you also say that language is a mode. So is there any difference between just in media ecology, yeah, between medium and mode? Because actually asking this question, I proceed from multimodal studies I'm involved in as well. And medium and mode are somewhat different there. So they are differentiated, yeah.
Well, one of the things that we always run into whenever we're trying to communicate about communicating or use language about language is that, at least to some extent, different scholars and then different schools use entirely different meanings for the same terms. So even I was just talking about it. I have a class on language and communication, and I was just, I was emphasizing Suzanne Langer's view on symbols, but then noting that that's different than Peirce's distinction between symbol and icon, right? So, so first of all, I want to say that my view of media ecology, but I think it's well informed, is not the only view. So there are other folks. Postman, he wasn't that interested in really getting down to exact philosophical distinctions. He was more interested in using media ecology to address significant issues. So he would use things as they worked for the purpose. But he did wind up distinguishing between technology and medium. McLuhan didn't, right? But he would say that, it's when a technology is used in a certain way, then it becomes a medium. So in answer to your question about mode, I don't use the term mode very much, so it's not of major significance to me. I don't know if you're familiar with Mark Poster. He was a kind of post-structuralist, and he used mode of communication. And he was sort of bringing in McLuhan and some others, but in a kind of, again, sort of neo-Marxist, post-structuralist, postmodernist kind of framework and all of that. So he referred to mode of information, mode of communication. So I just threw that in there because when I think of mode of communication, I'm thinking of, something like, am I giving a public address? I'm thinking, to me, it means a sort of situation. I didn't get into it, but it also refers to relationship. So when I'm communicating, say, to my wife, or to my son, or to my students, I mean, each time, or to a colleague, each relationship is different. And I bring that in as a form of mediation and therefore as a medium. So for me, my understanding of it was to try to bring in everything that could be understood as a medium. And that it's about how we mediate with each other and with our world, really the word medium is misleading. And this is something, again, from general semantics and from linguistic relativism, the idea that the real reality is in verbs rather than nouns. So it's really about mediating. So, I hope that, makes sense to you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot, Lance. Thanks.
Thanks a lot. And one more question from Vitaly Zhugai.
Hello, Lance. Thank you for this wonderful presentation. And my question is a bit of a double-sided question. So it has a practical side to it and a theoretical side to it. So the practical question is, what got you interested in language in the first place?
Well, I can't tell you because what I can say is that my parents were immigrants. They were Holocaust survivors and immigrants from what we call Eastern Europe because while Ukraine, of course, is a very well-defined, relatively well-defined area, many of even there, borders kept shifting and people moved around, so it's less well-defined than that. But and I grew up in a neighborhood in New York with a lot of folks who either escaped before World War II or survived, and really was a multilingual background. Even though this was part of the fault of sort of like American culture in mid-20th century and for immigrants of any, from any origin, was teach them English. They should speak English, right? And so we never, people of my generation tended not to be taught their parents' native languages. But I was surrounded by other languages. My parents came from different backgrounds, so they spoke German as their sort of common tongue to hide things from me when I was very little. So naturally, I started to pick it up. Although I don't really know it, but I have an affinity for the sound of that language because of that experience. And all I can say is, when I was in elementary school, we used to have book fairs where you could buy books. I remember I bought a book, I kept it, I still have it. And it was all about words. It was like, what's in a word? And it was, about language. It even mentions at the end, writing, the alphabet and printing. And I was like, and I'd forgotten about it. And then I was going through stuff, some time ago, and I found it. And it was like, wow, I was even interested in this, way back when I was a little kid. But especially my first semester as in college, I took a course in communication. And that's where I was introduced into general semantics and Sapir-Whorf, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and also systems theory and McLuhan, all of these things. And it was just fascinating. And so I wound up going into this.
Okay, thank you for this answer. And it's funny that you should say words, because I'm looking at your background. And
Yeah.
I don't think that's a coincidence, is it?
No.
No, definitely not. So the second part of the question is, you've probably heard that Facebook is being renamed to Meta, or the metaverse now.
Yeah.
And they are envisioning a future where everyone could access any point and place at time and communicate with anyone, with the only caveat being that we'll do it in a virtual reality. So you've talked much about language as a medium. And as you know, social networks provide this platform for us to communicate, even now that we're using Zoom. But do you envision that companies like Facebook or Meta could change the way we communicate in the future? Let's say in a virtual reality, does it affect the language? Or maybe it has some other effects on the way we interact with each other as humans?
It already has had effects. I know that on one side of it, and Meta is being mocked terribly. Online. Although it does come from an old cyberpunk novel, the idea of the metaverse, and it's actually fascinating. I also teach a little bit about science fiction, film, and TV, so I note these connections and how they're influencing people, and what they're doing. But and it's just the idea that just changing the name is somehow going to make things different. It is the idea that we react to language. We just had at the last course symposium, General Semantics Symposium, a young fellow who was doing research on Facebook, and I mentioned this before, Facebook groups being used to revive indigenous languages, and his interest is in indigenous languages in Canada, but also like Scottish, Gaelic, and I think that we'll see this as a kind of ongoing struggle. Obviously, there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the fact that so much of the internet is English language based. I like it. This is one of the rules of technological change: is there are winners and there are losers. With every technology. I think that the way my view on things, Vitaly, is that there's a lot of talk for a long time now about globalism. And I think in many different aspects of human life, we're moving in that direction. We've always known it. And it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be points where we move backwards. It's never just like this sort of homogeneous progress that the textbooks make things out to be. But in one sense, that old goal of almost universal language, we are moving in that direction through technology. And it may not be English, it may actually be the computer code that allows direct translation of, and interpretation of language, so that we can all speak our own language. But the other side of it, what it also opens up is the breaking down of homogeneity. That, you know, the idea that there is, say, a Ukrainian language, for example, and I'm not familiar at all with that, but my guess is that that has a lot to do with printing. You know, that when printing, you know, when typography came in, it led to a homogenization within national borders of language. I guess, you know, probably at that point, Ukraine was maybe part of Russia. I'm sorry, I apologize for not knowing the history. But in any event, in order to create homogeneous language within a border, just part of nationalism, you had to get rid of regional differences and even different languages. You know, as we know that there's no clear difference between language, dialect, you know, but you have to get rid of them. So that was the direction that printing pushed things in. To the same extent that we might have a universal language or a linguistic technology, that would also make it possible for national languages to dissolve in a way, to break down into regional differences. And that's where we see like the revival of Gaelic, this is something more familiar to me, in Ireland, in the revival of Welsh in Wales, and Gaelic, you know, and Scottish Gaelic, you know, that bringing that back is a breakdown of the homogeneity within national borders. So maybe Kiev has its own language that's different from other parts of Ukraine in the future. And, you know, so I'm sure you know that before printing, you know, as also that people were isolated, but within a few miles of each other, people couldn't understand each other because, you know, the linguistic drift was so great. But so anyway, that's what I would think would happen. You know, that we would have both the large scale universal but then on the smaller scale, much more of the regional, either revival or drift.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this answer.
Yeah, might take a few centuries, of course, you know, but I mean, look, you know, part of media ecology in the historical sense is that we can see patterns of history, how things worked in the past. When you see the patterns, you can at least get ideas of what may be coming. It's not that history repeats, but as the saying goes, it rhymes.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Do we have any questions? Yeah, Mira.
Hello, my name is Mira. So I have a question regarding your presentation, and the point is, you already mentioned that you speak only English, right? And I want to say a funny story, because usually the moment when we began to speak a foreign language, it was German. The teachers used to tell us the words of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. It's a German author, the Goethe, and he used to say, in German, if you do not speak a foreign language, you actually have no idea about your own. So this was a motivation to learn another language. So one more. And you also mentioned that technology gives us the opportunity basically to, you said that the different language give us also the different kind of thoughts, and the technology gives us the opportunity nowadays to know this different kind of thoughts even without learning another language, because nowadays we can translate everything what we see, even on Facebook, as it was mentioned. If we see a post, immediately translate it. Yes. Yeah. So in this case, actually, me personally, I have the feeling that we go from many thoughts to one main thought controlled by someone else, not by us. We are just the one who are being controlled and manipulated. This is my opinion. But we also speak a lot what happened in the past. Could you tell us, please, how do you see the language or the communication in the next 10 years in the future?
Well, I just want to say that I didn't mean to say that with sort of universal translation, it would allow us to think in the other language. It doesn't. And that, I mean, I like the quote from Goethe, and I agree. You know, I won't say that I'm completely ignorant of other languages. I just don't feel like I'm fluent enough and, you know, to really feel comfortable. You know, I was just thinking of my high school French teacher, who was very strict, but we all adored her, and she knew many languages. And I remember her saying that, you know, for example, when she thinks in different languages for different things. And I forget what the language was. Maybe it was Portuguese for cooking. You know, that when she cooks, she cooks in a different language. So I do think, you know, that, I mean, I regret it. You know, I mean, I'm old now. So, I mean, we have the saying, you can't teach an old dog new tricks. But I mean, I regret that I don't know other languages. And I think that the fact of universal translation will impoverish folks. It doesn't give us that ability to think in other languages. The Italians have a saying that translate and I don't want to like bungle Italian. So the English version of it is translator trader, because the two words are very similar in Italian. And yeah, that's it. Traditori. I'm sure an Italian would cringe hearing me say this. You know, so I don't think that the universal translation will really allow us to think in the other language. As for control, and I like to make the point that, you know, you're saying, you know, we think in language, right? And we express ourselves in language, and we didn't create the language. So we're all thinking with words that we didn't invent, that are not original to us. So, you know, it's like, if you have to actually think about it that way, it's like how much of what you're thinking is really yours at all, right? Yeah, you know, and that, you know, seems relevant to the idea of control, because it goes back to the idea that to the extent that you can control the language that people uses, you're modifying their thinking. But I suspect you're referring to more of the larger issue of like surveillance, use of technology for surveillance, those kinds of things. Is that, and I think it's, you know, even in the Iliad, that, you know, it's like we're never free from strife. So, I mean, on the one hand, yes, the possibilities for control are increased. Also, the liberating possibilities. If you've followed any of the things that have come up in the United States, like George Floyd, the fact that people have phones with cameras and can record what's going on has been very liberating as well. So it becomes a new site of conflict. But the potential is there. You know, we also see, I mean, going back to the early days of the internet, the ability of people to connect to each other. It has allowed marginalized groups to organize for their own benefit. And, so it's been a boon for them. It's also allowed terrorists, people and criminals to organize for their own benefit. And, so what changes are the dynamics, as opposed to one way or another. I think as much as possible, what we want to try to work for, fight for, is the open society, transparency. That has become the big buzzword. But really, the more that we know about what our leaders are doing, what people in power are doing, and the more we have a say in what's going on. And I think that's, the really important point right now, which means, for me, that forget privacy. Privacy's dead. Another generation or two, they won't even know what we were talking about. They won't even understand what we lost as far as privacy. So forget about that. Let's insist on absolute transparency and openness, for everybody, including the people in power. And, and that's our best hope for the future.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for these answers and our perspectives. We're getting rid actually of privacy. Sounds actually horribly, I'd say, but perhaps we do need transparency, I think.
Well, it sounds horrible to us, sure, because we're not used to it. Although it, there was an old saying when privacy ended with the telephone, when people allowed telephones into their homes, they allowed the outside world to interrupt them. And there was even a kind of jokey term early, like back in the 70s, from some of the older folks involved in media ecology. They called it telephonus interruptus, which is modeled after coitus interruptus, because back before there were answering machines, people would answer the telephone even if they were engaged in the act of love. I'm glad, Vitaly, you like that one. But that was, it was like Pavlov's dogs as far as the telephone's concerned. But we're long past this point. There's also the thing, no one has had a complete thought since the invention of the telephone, as well, because people are constantly getting interrupted. But privacy, our sense of privacy is much less than the older, the World War II generation that's still around. They thought the baby boomers is, were ridiculously like, for us, I'll explain, my daughter's an adult now. She was diagnosed with autism when she was young. And for my parents' generation, this is something you would never tell anybody. This is private, it's secret. Just like someone is diagnosed with cancer, don't tell people, keep it a secret. Our generation, it's like you tell people, you share knowledge, you connect to other people when you deal with these things. So our sense of privacy was very much less than their sense of privacy. But we're horrified by what some of some of the millennials post on Instagram, sure, we did crazy stuff, but we didn't take pictures of it and put it out on social media. That's private, because we're breaking the law, or we're doing stuff that we shouldn't be doing, or, it's private. And, these younger folks are just putting it out there on social media. It's like, hey, so we're shocked by that. So, I mean, each generation, it's been lessening. And again, I think, you follow the pattern. another generation or two. So the other thing is that privacy didn't exist before. Right? And this actually Hannah Arendt talks about this, right? That the private person in ancient Greece was an idiot. Now, idio, is an individual, right? Like idiom, but it was a private person is someone who didn't have a public identity. A private person was a woman, sorry, but I mean, back in that, or a slave. Only a citizen was a public person. And we do a lot of etymology, right? Privacy, private, deprived, right? A private person is someone who's deprived. And it's only in the last few centuries after printing. Why is privacy connected to printing? Because when people start reading, right, reading requires privacy, and it sort of enforces this idea of being a private individual. So right now you're all listening to me. Maybe some of the folks who are muted aren't, but we're all together in a way as one. But if I all started reading the exact same thing at the exact same time, you would be alone as individuals reading it. So if you're teaching, that the way you lose the class is when you have them all read something by themselves. I don't know if you still do. I mean, you used to pass out materials, pass out papers to the class, and then everyone's reading it, you lose the class. So privacy is connected to print and literacy and is eroded once electronics are introduced. And the more fully we're involved in electronics, the more the less privacy exists, because it's artificial. That's the thing, is it's hard for us to realize that the circumstances that we're used to, which are recent and artificial in the sense that they're not the way people have lived for most of human history. And if that's the case, then they probably won't last as things change.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Dear
Thank
Lance.
you very much for this discussion.
Yes, it will be useful for us. Yeah.
Now we are moving on, perhaps to the next topic, which is also mine. And I think it's really interesting because I'm going to talk about media environment as well. And one of the terms which I really like, after I have watched several videos of Lance, it is also the media ecology ethics. And I'm going to discuss it in my report, in my short topic too, in my small talk. So we're going to start, I think. I hope you see my presentation.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks very much. So we're going to talk to the topic called Socio and Psycholinguistic Profile of War in Mass Media within the Media Ecology framework. So the modern mass media is not only a means of public opinion information, an elaborated system of obtaining and retranslating the up-to-date information about the most important world news, but also a substantial part of the ecological environment in which humanity exists. Therefore, intercultural communication is based on ideas and stereotypes widespread in the media space, disseminated and reduplicated by numerous online publications, ensuring their global impact. The digitalization of the information flow changes the process of delivering media content extensively. The influence of media communication on mass consciousness is actively studied also within one of the modern linguistic areas, media ecology. And this research within the general framework of media ecology is a part of our project, Ecolinguistic Modes of Discursive Space of Ukraine in the European Multicultural Continuum, supported by the National Research Foundation of Ukraine. The main publications are presented on the slide. Media ecology within the ecolinguistic modes of discursive studies, considered as multimodal, Helen Kappel, aims at promoting ecolinguistic consciousness, harmonizing the coexistence of different languages and cultures in a multicultural, multilingual continuum, contributing to the formation of post-humanism ethics, which is determined by a new way of thinking, focused on achieving the common well-being. In this context, media and journalists, as well as translators, have a shared responsibility for the atmosphere they create, which a priori should be aimed at uniting society rather than inciting conflict and hostility. It is crucial to determine how media content affects the formation of speaker-specific ideas, forming their figurative world, because that is namely the emotional plane of publications, which is the basis for their success and citation rank. The ecolinguistic perspective within modern linguistic studies proclaims a departure from the anthropocentric worldview, which is more focused on humans who perceive nature solely as means of satisfying their needs. Instead, the ecolinguistic approach to communication is enhanced, according to which much attention is paid to each statement correctness and the consequences it causes. The role of the translator-interpreter is changing significantly, predetermining the active position of a mediator who realizes the importance of the ecological balance in a particular speech community, makes efforts to guarantee this balance by choosing the right translation equivalents, giving background information for the so-called asymmetrical editions. Sometimes that means for translator and interpreter being a peacemaker and contributing to the media ecology ethics. The functions of semantical transformations while translating and interpreting, and the role of the translator's personality often remains invisible for the readers. They perceive the source text and the target text as the same source of information, unaware of the semantic changes on the cultural and linguistic planes. The proposed research aims at outlining primary associations related to the concept of war, revealing the impact of mass media on the representation and conceptualization of war in German-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking focus groups. English is considered as well. Examining the understanding of the main metaphorical and metonymical patterns which create an anthropomorphic image of war. It is the anthropomorphic image of war in mass media publications that draws readers' attention to the incompatibility of human nature and global devastating and cruel consequences of war. The latter allows journalists to cultivate a critical attitude to the military actions according to the ecolinguistic media ecology approach. The semantics of the anthropomorphic metaphors of war makes them a real challenge for translation because of the multi-layer meanings implied and their powerful manipulative impact on the readership. The empirical data is extracted mainly from German and Ukrainian papers, but the English-Ukrainian context and different asymmetrical editions are considered as well. At the first stage of the study, the anthropomorphic metaphors were derived from the context in German and Ukrainian mass media, dated from 2014-2021. The corpus of text of the German Language Institute in Mannheim was used to record the anthropomorphic representation, physiological and psychological profile of war in German. The empirical data helped to identify the basic conceptual models of the anthropomorphic representation of war in German and Ukrainian mass media, in particular the metaphorical ones. For example, war a living being, war a human being, war has parts of the body, also imaginary or virtual. For example, the face of war, war the embodiment of parents, of a father, mother, war a liar, war a destroyer. It is always a tremendous challenge to find suitable metaphor while translating which would respect the language's diversity and different mental organization of the language speakers, their life experience, significantly different worldviews, and consider different metaphorical conceptualizations of the world. That would mean applying an ecological approach aimed at mutual understanding and preserving the speaker's identity. Several examples will help us to understand the main problem of the research concerning also the translation of these metaphors. One of these problems is that war is masculine in German language, der Krieg, and feminine in the Ukrainian language, Vina. The German folklore entails such images as der Gevatter Tod, Godfather death, and within this pattern war is described in certain context as mother in Ukrainian. There is need for adaptation and descriptive translation of this metaphor, such as an expression as como vina, como mata ridna, some experience the war, some make profit of it, cannot be directly translated into German or English. Of course, some images are equivalent in different languages and in the contrasted languages too, such as German Kinder des Krieges, children of war, Dite viny in Ukrainian. Within this metaphorical pattern, we can give birth, war can give birth and bring up its children. As we see the example on the slide, sometimes war gives rise to surprises which are only indirectly connected with military actions. For example, in the field of education, gives rise, or literally speaking, gives birth. The anthropomorphic image of war is also formed by the verbs, usually describing human being acts, such as to bring up, to come, to take away. Війна триває і забирає нові жертви майже щодня. Literally speaking, the war harvests the new victims almost every day. And it is translated as that the war continues with casualties on a nearly daily basis. These examples are retrieved from the Ukrainian edition Den, which has an English version in its platform. And it is evident from the contexts above that the English-speaking version does not preserve the anthropomorphic metaphor of war, and the personified image of war is lost. The pragmatic effect will be surely different. The dual nature of war assigned the human traits of character by its deeds, which should awake the inner protest in the audience, is gone away, and the emotional plane of the statement implicated by the metaphor usage has been changed to the informative one. The choice between casualty and victim in the English version is also rather discrepant. Thus, it's clear that a translator's choice can crucially change the manipulative shade of the publication. And the problem evoked by this metaphorical pattern is that it is not always only metaphorical one, but can also be the metaphonemical one. For example, if we compare in German pro-westliches versus pro-russisches Gesicht, or in the English language pro-Western versus pro-Russian face, pro-західне, pro-російське обличчя. It's not only the personified image of war, the metaphorical one, that is created, but also a metonymical part-whole relation is reconstructed to mean that certain people represent the image of war. They are embodiments of war. The metaphonymy enriches the context with its double sense interpretation implicated by one stylistic figure. There is still a need for explanations and translators' comments on the topic. In the case with the German weibliches, männliches Gesicht des Krieges, in the English language masculine, feminine, or male, female face of war, чоловіче, жіноче обличчя війни, a translator is dealing with various contexts and allusions. As it has been already mentioned, both direct allusions to the image of war as of a woman in the Ukrainian language and as of a warrior, a soldier, a man in German have been recorded. Such images are influenced by gender labeling. The opposition of the womanly nature and inhuman cruelty is implied. We can compare it with the title of Svetlana Alexievich's well-known book, The Unwomanly Face of War, an oral history of women in the Second World War. The survey displays the situation that war in the traditional view of the Ukrainian-speaking respondents as well appears not only in a woman's image, but also as death with a scythe over the shoulders, but women are mostly viewed as victims of war. The anthropocentric worldview in this case allows emphasizing the dualism of eco-conscious attitude to life, nature, and blatant disregard for all moral values and ideas. And still, there is an obvious tone in gender symmetry today in Ukraine, as women are viewed upon not solely as Bereginya, who cares about the family, but also as warriors able to defend their own country. It should be mentioned that the definition of war itself is vast in its meanings, and it is used in absolutely different ways. In different combination, one can talk about war of religion, war on terror, or the so-called language wars, or the war of ideas and ideologies, war of laws, pravo vina, paperova vina. There is a certain trivialization and aestheticization of war, which is observed in media publications. When violence is treated as heroical actions, Kriegsverherrlichung auf Deutsch, even as a certain kind of achievements and world records, as the news about sniper fire considered as a world record on the slide. So the Canadian sniper shot his target from a large distance, and it is actually considered to be a world record. It also leads to a new culture of reception and to visual aestheticization of war, reflected with such new terms as in German Strate's Krieg der Bilder, war of pictures or photos, vina svitlin. In this case, nomination is explained by a wide range of pictures, photos processed in Photoshop and flooding the internet sources. They are concentrated on presenting the event as vividly and heroically as possible, even though all these images are connected with people's deaths. Their main goal is to shock the reader, impress him with devastations and blood, and journalists are much less concerned about the consequences of such illustrations. This fact presupposes different reaction of the speakers of different languages talking about the same events. Their life experience involving war as their present-day situation, past or future potential threat is displayed in their reactions to the offered questions in the conducted survey. And so we come to the second stage of the research. At the second stage of this research, the sociolinguistic experiment and the word association test within the psycholinguistic experiment framework were conducted to verify the data obtained during the analysis of mass media publications in German and Ukrainian, which formed an anthropomorphic profile of war. An experiment was performed using a questionnaire to identify the main associations connected with the notion of war, metaphorical and metonymical cliches and set expressions, which are used by the speakers of German and Ukrainian to determine the influence of mass media discourse on the formation of ideas about war by respondents. A pilot survey result, which should become a model for further surveys, was conducted, and it was launched in Germany at the Ruhr University in Bochum and in Ukraine. Questions were offered to 50 respondents as a pilot survey, which formed a focus group in the compared languages. Their answers were thoroughly analyzed, and each questionnaire contained a combination of 15 closed and open-ended questions within a free and targeted word association test. The experiment's socio-demographic component was based on the fact that the vast majority of respondents will be native speakers of the languages under study, living mainly in Germany or respectively in Ukraine. The respondents' age limits were determined in the intervals 18-29, 30-39, 40-49, 15 and above, to involve respondents of different age and cultural experience. Most of the Respondents who took part in the pilot survey professionally are involved in the humanitarian sector. However, there are representatives of the medical, economic, and other sectors. The sociolinguistic and psycholinguistic analysis was used to evaluate the empirical study results. So one of the introductory survey's question determines how the respondents prefer to obtain the information, the most relevant news from various media sources and platforms. As the result shows, 84% of Ukrainian speakers use internet sources to obtain the most up-to-date information. And the low level of trust in the television news and other programs broadcasted on television is obvious. Only 4% of respondents in Ukraine use it as a source of information. The ability to obtain information from various sources is inherent for the speakers of both contrasted languages, German and Ukrainian. However, the variability of different information sources, including printed media, editions, television, social networks, links from acquaintances, and other sources, even communication with eyewitnesses, is a typical feature of German-speaking respondents. 64% of them mostly use online sources to find information about the latest news in the world. The importance of the associative connection between the concept of war and the psycho-emotional state of a person is further demonstrated by questions aimed at forming a network of semantic interrelation within the psychological and physiological profile of war. A number of questions concern forming a global psychophysiological anthropomorphic portrait of the war and the events in eastern Ukraine. If 100 of Ukrainian-speaking respondents expectedly gave positive answer to the question, "Are you informed about the latest events in eastern Ukraine?" the reaction of German-speaking respondents was somewhat different. 72% gave an affirmative answer to this question. 12% thought they were not informed about the latest events in eastern Ukraine, and optionally appeared such answers as more or less informed, partially informed. 4% said that the German mass media have been recently rarely writing about the latest news from eastern Ukraine. The information is not sufficient. And the informational coverage of these events, in their opinion, is also not sufficient. An equally important problem that arises during the analysis of media reports in German and Ukrainian mass media is the equivalence of concepts to describe events in Ukraine. In German, we have different notions such as der Krieg, war, Wiener, militärische Auseinandersetzung, military conflict, military confrontation. In Ukrainian, we have військове протистояння, озброєний конфлікт, тощо. Respondents were asked to provide an appropriate definition of events in eastern Ukraine, using the above concepts, or to provide their own definition. 30% of German-speaking respondents described the situation in Ukraine as militärische Auseinandersetzung, military conflict, military confrontation. 36% as der Krieg, war. 12% chose der Konflikt, conflict. This data indicates that the respondents' opinion is formed by the media sources, which tend to use a cautious term for military actions to avoid the term war in German discourse. Still, a significant number of respondents and a vast majority of the analyzed mass media reports clearly define the latest events in eastern Ukraine as war. The majority of the Ukrainian-speaking respondents describe the events in eastern Ukraine as war, 56%. 24% of respondents chose the term військове протистояння, military conflict, military confrontation, збройний conflict, armed conflict. And within this focus group, no respondent, no one, chose the variant conflict. Suggested alternatives, and these alternatives were as follows: money laundering, nightmare, circus, the struggle for survival of Ukraine. The German mass media sources such as Deutsche Welle for instance, tend to use the diplomatic cliches in the materials published in Ukrainian, including such lexical variants as settlement of the situation in eastern Ukraine, conflict resolution in the area of the joint forces operation, and so on and so forth. This tendency is explained by the diplomatic protocol. The clear difference between the designation for the same situation used by the focus group of the Ukrainian and German-speaking respondents is observed. A translator should also follow the same protocol in official publication and has the right to choose a more neutral variant from the above mentioned, or just the opposite, semantically more intensive lexeme to describe the latest news from Ukraine. One of the questions was offered to assess whether war or military actions could be perceived as a positive phenomenon. 64% of German-speaking respondents believe that war has always only negative consequences. 20% think that in the absence of civilian casualties or in the struggle to overthrow the dictatorship, war can have a positive impact. The Ukrainian-speaking respondents expressed similar views. 64% said that war could only lead to negative consequences, and 28% showed the answer that war could have some positive consequences and also indicated as the necessary condition for such circumstances the absence of civilian casualties, the struggle for liberation from dictatorship or freedom in general. The lexemes denoting new strategies and tactics of war, German, der hybride Krieg, hybrid war, der Informationskrieg, information war, information warfare, are a bit differently treated by the German-speaking and Ukrainian-speaking community, and different war appellations are used to describe the military actions in eastern Ukraine. As an example, a clear difference between the notions of the information war as of the new strategy of information manipulation with fake news and propaganda, misuse of information, and of the information warfare as a means of military intelligence, suppression and neutralization being a part of military invasion, also cyber attacks, psychological operators using persuasive strategies, is not always reflected in publications, and so we can compare two contexts, two examples, the Ukrainian one and the parallel translation in English. The same notion in German, der Informationskrieg, corresponds entirely to the Ukrainian word combination informacyjna wojna. And so we can draw some conclusions. Awareness of the social significance, the global nature of military action is achieved according to the obtained data mainly in the emotional plane. So manipulative media content is of great importance. The notion of ecological consciousness, distinguished within the conceptual paradigm of media ecology, describes the tendency to raise the moral responsibility in the media environment, even if it is the mere translation of the already existing contents. The responsibility for the linguistic decoration of current publications lies with journalists, who by creating vivid imagery, also with anthropomorphic metaphors, directly influence readers' perception of certain events. Presenting the information about military events, analyzing and translating the world news, the journalists can emphasize that we exist in a multicultural, multilingual, and richly diverse society where the humans are not the center of the universe anymore. On the other hand, it is also important to appeal to the anthropocentric worldview inherent in speakers of any language to stress a vital necessity of avoiding military conflicts. The semantics of the anthropomorphic metaphors, metaphonymy as an interplay of metaphor and metonymy, makes these stylistic figures a real challenge for translation because of the multi-layer meanings. And the mass media can draw attention to the inconsistency of what is happening globally, forming the psychological and physiological profile of war within the basic associative anthropomorphic ideas of a human being about the surrounding world. The anthropomorphic metaphor being an instrument of powerful manipulative influence on the readership comes into focus of media ecology as an element of the ecolinguistic consciousness. Further research prospects include studying the associative basis for developing an anthropomorphic image of war in the socio-psycholinguistic dimensions. The language samples could be extensively expanded, and the problem of aestheticization and trivialization of war within the media ecology framework deserves a separate investigation. Thank you very much for your attention. And I'm ready to answer your questions if there are any. Jan Kapranov, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for your report, Lena, and you mentioned two directions, sociolinguistic and psycholinguistics, and my questions deals with the psycholinguistics, actually. The psycholinguistic question is the following: what were the social groups that were involved into this survey? Can you mention? You mentioned about 50 respondents, and what were the social groups?
Mostly these are the young people. We couldn't avoid by such a number of a pilot survey, we couldn't avoid the problem that the 50 and above was much more or less actually depicted or analyzed group in our survey. And actually, though there were some people with the age 50 plus, and actually, most of them are engaged in the humanitarian sector, in the academic sector, and the young people also. And still among those respondents, there are some working in the field of medicine, as I've told, economic sector, managers, for example, and in some other groups, I mean, professionally. And as we're talking about the largest group, and these are young people, this is actually the group which has access to all the platforms, to all the media sources, and they have this opportunity to combine different media sources, and they do it as well. Actually, surprising for me was actually the tendency that I expected that the Ukrainian respondents would not have a great trust in television and in newspapers, and they will tend to combine different sources and to check the information they obtain. But actually, it was surprising for me that the German-speaking respondents gave quite a lot of combinations as their own options, talking about the sources of information, and even such as speaking to the eyewitnesses. And I think they mean talking about talking with friends over Zoom or phone or something like that. But it is a great interest to receive the most up-to-date information and still to check if it's really like it is presented in the mass media.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Lance, thank you very much.
Okay, there we go.
That's great.
Yeah, this was this was great. It was really lovely to hear this talk, and just trying to, there we go. I am particularly fascinated about the gender difference because, of course, we don't have gendered nouns in English, and in linguistic relativism, there's always the question of, does that really make a difference? And there's some arguments that it doesn't, but other arguments that it does. So it's very interesting to see that comparison. Yeah, I would just note that, you know, some other points that come up, there's the fact that war is a noun. So we think of it, a noun could be a person or a thing, but as opposed to thinking of it, you know, when we try to think of ways of thinking differently, that to think of it as a verb, as something that's done and not as a noun or as an event. And think of it, it's referred to singularly to think of it in plural, rather than there be a cause of war, there are causes of wars, and that each one is different. Also that war is an abstract term, and personifying it makes it concrete. And this goes back to oral culture, where you have, at say Ares and Athena, made me think of that, that we personify it, and it's a way to make it easier to understand. I just found all of that, quite interesting. And McLuhan actually suggested that war is a form of education, that people who are subjected to war learn, and it's often that the more advanced, technologically advanced society that conducts war against the other society, that other society learns from that, so that it becomes a form of education, obviously not a good one, but I did think about also that war is a metaphor. And I remember reading, I think it was earlier in the pandemic, because in the US, the war metaphor is common. So the war on drugs, the war on poverty. And so, the war against the COVID. And I remember reading that Germany did not use the war metaphor to refer to their, I keep thinking, battle, the medical effort to cure or prevent coronavirus. And one of the explanations was that their experience with war was rather negative, so that they were reluctant to use that metaphor. So I just thought that might relate to to their response or their way of framing it in their media environment. I will say that we're not hearing it as a war. The way it's presented right now is not that there's a war going on, but that the Russians are amassing troops on the border, and there's a threat of, even when they don't say it as a threat of war, of invasion. Of course, for a lot of it is framed as Putin's aggression, and falls into a lot of it's personified with him as being, what he wants, what Putin wants, that he still resents what happened to the Soviet Union, that he hates the West, and that he's also trying to distract from problems with the Russian economy. But it does tend to get personified in, I think, our obsession with Putin as opposed to anything else. So it's just very interested to hear this research. I think it really is, excellent contribution.
Thanks a lot, Lance. And I think actually it is the truth. And actually what I do observe, analyzing different publications in Ukrainian and German, for example, in English, especially when we are talking about asymmetrical editions, these are the parallel translations from Ukrainian into English and vice versa. They are to be equivalent. But then we can notice that by translation into German, for example, a journalist or a translator, I've mentioned several times already earlier that they are called journalators today, as they actually are translating their papers. And so they tend to actually neutralize their publications. So if all the context in Ukrainian will be with the word war, and it's actually the situation in Ukraine, we have this war, then it will be a bit more neutralized in German, and they will talk about the situation, about the threat, and so on and so forth. But in the last several years, the situation actually has changed. They are writing more often also about war, but still they tend to these neutral cliches. As you've mentioned in the USA, if they are talking about threat and about this certain situation on the border and so on and so forth. And it's a pity if a journalist in Ukrainian is more, I'd say, emotional and is not neutral in his publication. And still it is translated in a more neutral way. But perhaps following these diplomatic cliches, so this tendency not to frighten the people. So as COVID, the threat is actually horrible, but still let us try to talk about it mildly, in a more mild way, so to say. Thanks. If there are no more questions, we can pass to the next topic, I think, which is a wonderful one because it's brand new, innovative, and of course, very up to date.
Yes, maybe we go to the next speaker, no?
Yeah, that's right. I'm talking about Olena already and about this brilliant topic, COVID-19 conspiracy theories and transmedia viruses.
Well, I'm trying to share the screen and I'll try to make it full screen just a second. Is it fine if it's like that? Because I don't know, I can't do that full screen.
I think it's quite okay. People try.
Oh, maybe like that.
Sorry, if you're using a Windows computer, you can simply press F5. F5.
Oh, yeah, I have already done that. Yes, thank you.
Does it work?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. All right, so thanks a lot actually for providing me with such an opportunity and inviting me to participate in this wonderful webinar. And first of all, I hope that all of you remember the poster, yes, to the webinar. So do you remember the poster to the webinar and actually visual images on the poster? So except for actually pictures of the speakers, right, and participants. And I think that Olena has chosen an image of a chessboard, actually, yes, and chess pieces, not by accident. Is it so, Olena?
Yes, and it is the idea of Vitaly, actually, as we've thought about the technical details, he had such a brilliant idea, I think, which I expected at once.
Okay, so one actually of the ideas that popped up in my mind in this regard is that generally chessboard, right, symbolizes a battlefield. So, and definitely it is related, it is associated with war to some extent. And our today's topic is anthropomorphic of the webinar itself. Yes, anthropomorphic profile of war in socio and psycholinguistic dimensions. So I'm presenting today the face of COVID-19 war, actually the face of war, which I really liked from, again, Olena's presentation. And first of all, what I would like to say that already Lance has mentioned about COVID-19, its metaphoric conceptualization. And it's really so. And I would say that, for example, in Italy and in France, the metaphor of COVID-19 as war has been, I would say, really wide spread. And talking about metaphoric conceptualization and its entailments, which we can come across in various media on various platforms in the internet, actually not only offline as well, so can be grouped up as follows. Yes, virus is an enemy. Then healthcare personnel are frontline warriors. People isolating at home are home fronts, and people breaking the social distancing rules are traitors and deserters. actually, it's possible to provide such a list, let's say, of conceptual or cognitive metaphors, analyzing linguistic material, so actually text, speech, right, and also analyzing visual conceptualization, metaphoric conceptualizations of war. And just to give an example, in the United States, yes, Donald Trump conceptualized himself as a wartime president, and who is fighting against the invisible enemy. The same could be said about New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, and actually his description of doctors, right, and nurses in the hospitals as soldiers, and that they are the soldiers who are fighting this battle for us. So actually a lot of various examples in different languages can be given here. However, the metaphor of war, COVID-19 particularly as war, is really criticized, right? Because it influences, it manipulates our minds. It actually has some consequences, right, on our behavior, because people start feeling themselves being really soldiers, or the ones who have to fight. And it causes psychological disorders. It can cause panic and many drastic consequences. So, and as I have already mentioned, yes, the metaphor of war, it is presented not just verbally, right, but also visual and other resources, semiotic resources. They somehow interact and integrate with verbal resources and construct various meanings of COVID being war. So in the same vein, we can say that pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, which has grasped the whole world, it is also accompanied by infodemic. So, and infodemic is explained, right, as a flood of information which we encounter in the internet, so in virtual space, in virtual environment, and of course in printed media as well, on TV as well, and of course in social media. So of course this information includes not only, let's say, actual information, but it includes also misinformation, disinformation, and it can be terminologically labeled also as myths and as viruses, which really pollute the environment of technological environment, virtual environment, physical environment, and in such a way, again, shape our mind, which leads to not really positive, but rather negative consequences. So one of the examples, it's not yet about conspiracy theories, but anyway, one of the examples of kind of semi-fake or semi-myth, which has been presented in the media. It was actually the depiction, so of one of the pictures by Walter Malina. So, and actually it was a newspaper, Italian newspaper in somewhere around the 1970s, and this Italian weekly paper, it featured, as you can see on the slide,
we cannot see. I'm sorry. Perhaps we should actually check, because I think we should see it right now.
Yeah, and what slide can you see now?
The first
one.
just the first one. Okay.
If you look at the panel below, there's a button. Поясню українською, тому що у вас російський інтерфейс. П'ята кнопка справа від заметки. Це показ слайдів, він у вас має запуститися. От подивіться на панель знизу.
Так.
Там, де у вас, бачите, мінус, плюс масштаб, і лівіше значок – це показ слайдів. Натисніть на нього.
А зараз перший слайд є, так?
Зараз 6-й слайд, але у вас режим показу не включений.
А зараз іде переключення слайдів чи ні?
Ні. Спробуйте натиснути на клавішу показу слайдів. Там, де у вас масштаб, біля неї є кнопочка. Подивіться, будь ласка, знизу. Це правий нижній кут. Біля мінуса лівіше є кнопка. От на неї натисніть.
Я щось не бачу. Давайте, можливо, я буду просто не буду робити великий екран, а буду просто переключати слайди таким чином.
Можете ще зверху глянути. Дивіться, там, де у вас є от верхня панель, четверта іконка. Четверта. От, перша – це зберегти, друга – це відкатити назад, третя – ще щось, і от четверта – це також показ слайдів. Повинен бути.
Ні, не працює. Тобто у мене працює лише, от якщо я натискаю F5, то я бачу, і у мене слайди переключаються.
Тоді спробуйте зупинити share screen і заново його запустити.
А можливо, а от так, якщо я переключаю, то видно, слайди переключаю?
Так, видно.
Да, я думаю, давайте, щоб просто не втрачати час, то будемо робити так, і все.
That's all right. Okay.
Yeah, okay, sorry for some technical issues. All right, so that was an example of Walter Molina depiction, kind of a semi-fake, which circulated around various social networks, and not only, I think it was around summer, so the past summer. And actually, this is an illustration to the article, and this illustration shows kind of vehicles which are referred to as singlets, and they were believed to be the vehicles of future, which can help humanity to avoid traffic jams. So of course you can see their shape, right? And actually, when it circulated the internet, the discussions that were around that kind of Walter Molina, so he predicted, or was trying to predict what could happen right in future, actually in terms of COVID-19 pandemic in particular, so that we all have to be in isolation. But of course, this is kind of a semi-fake. It can be regarded as a semi-fake visual representation or a prediction of future for COVID. But one of the visual and multimodal, I would say, parallels could be established with the following events. And I will try to demonstrate it. Maybe just a video, but a very short piece just for you to see. Probably you're aware of this event, and I will comment on that then. And can you hear the sound?
Actually not. It should be shared with the presentation.
Yeah.
When you share the presentation, there is a button to share sound.
Is it okay if I just it'll be just for a second, not to waste time, right?
Yeah, it's quite understandable. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So I think that you can then surf in the net and watch it. Okay, kind of that. So actually, this is a concert by an American band, Flaming Lips, which took place in October 2020 in Oklahoma. And actually, as you can see, the participants of the band itself and the visitors, the audience, they are all in kind of balloons. Yeah, so they are all isolated. So then on the one hand, actually, I don't know, it was my idea to draw kind of a parallel between the previous depiction, right, of prediction of future, yeah, by Walter Molina in late 20th century, in the 20th century, in the mid 20th century, and actually what is happening today, and how particularly, right, artists, musicians, actors are trying to survive in the pandemic world. Okay, so generally speaking, as the topic of this presentation says, that it is about conspiracy, COVID-19 conspiracy theories being transmedia viruses, yeah, and the perspective taken is actually ecolinguistic COVIDology in action. Generally speaking, I would say that the presentation takes a kind of a transdisciplinary perspectives, because I've been trying to combine some of the theoretical aspects from media ecology, from ecolinguistics, then linguistic COVIDology, and multimodality studies to explain actually the character of conspiracy theories, COVID-19, and why we can regard them as actually transmedia viruses. So I understand that all of us know what conspiracy theory actually is, right? It is, and it can be an attempt to explain, yeah, or it can be simply an explanation of harmful or tragic events as the result of the actions of a small, powerful group. And such explanations, usually they reject the accepted narrative surrounding of the presented events. And sometimes these conspiracy theories, their official versions may be seen as further proof of the conspiracy. So just the key components of what conspiracy theory actually is rejection of something standard, something accepted, something stereotypical. And as I have already mentioned, so the branches, right, I would say paradigms that were chosen to explain COVID-19 conspiracy theories, you can see them on the slide. And the main terms, the main concepts which were chosen are the concepts of medium and mode. So they serve as certain bundles which can connect, which can connect the mentioned theories. On the one hand, if we analyze media ecology perspective, then we understand, as Lance has already told us today, that medium is an environment. Yes, so and media really are multiple. So if we actually approach, if we approach the notion of media from a multimodal perspective, then in multimodality, which is explained as an integration of various semiotic modes or semiotic resources in communication, like verbal and non-verbal. Again, this is language, these are visual, static, or dynamic images, graphics, music, gestures, etc. Then medium is explained as socially, so it has a number of definitions, either socially or historically situated practice, biotype for symbiosis, or even incubator for creating various combinations of modes. So I would here I would resort to explaining or to treating media from the perspective of media ecology, of media being an environment, and mode or multiplicity of modes interacting in actually multimodal meaning making as semiotic resources which make up or which create the medium. It can be either virtual medium or it can be offline, right? Kind of physical medium. And talking about getting back here and talking about the theory of transmediality. So the theory of transmediality actually presented by Henry Jenkins, and one of his earliest books on transmediality entitled Convergence Culture. So actually where transmediality is treated as actually dispersion of various content across a number of media. And the most widespread examples of transmediality, classical examples would be like, for example, Star Wars. So Star Wars being actually a film. So, and Star Wars where meaning making is in place. So you can buy, for example, Lego constructor or something like that. So talking about conspiracy theories, COVID-19 conspiracy theories, in terms of these notions from the suggested perspectives, actually, I would say that, again, COVID-19 conspiracy theories, they are created, they are constructed across various media, physical, etc. Physical, technological, medium as environment, yes, physical, symbolic, technological, etc. However, they are created with the help of or in the integration of a number of semiotic modes or resources, visual, audio, and of course, verbal. So, and even in this case, as medium for COVID-19 theories, media is even treated as virus, medium is treated as virus, it's virus itself. Then proceeding to the notion of linguistic COVIDology that we resort to. So actually in 2020, there was a book on COVID written by Yasser Nem. So actually a doctor and also he's a writer. So he suggested kind of an encyclopedia of COVID through different stages of its development, through its waves, etc., etc. So, and a vast array of various research in interdisciplinary perspective took place, appeared as well. So there's an array of research on COVID metaphors. Yes, it's not only conceptualized as a war, right? Then also you can see on the slide a number of other research that has been conducted in this area, in this sphere. So also a lot of events, academic events and simply webinars, discussions that have been taken place around COVID-19, explaining its character, interdisciplinary character, and the consequences, etc. And one of the events which is presented, which I have been attending for about almost a year, was organized in Germany. It was online by the scholars of Aachen University, and it was pandemic storytelling, where scholars from different fields of study participated, and there always was a discussion about this or that aspect of COVID-19. So COVID-19 conspiracy theories can be grouped. I think that we all know that into a number of types. So first of all, COVID-19 origin, whether it is kind of a lab leak, it was a lab leak, or an animal jump, as they sometimes put it in the media, or animal-human jump. So also conspiracy theories, they regard COVID-19 treatment. So usually when someone is disposed to COVID-19 or has been infected with COVID-19, they say that you have to take some vitamins, some supplements, and so it will help for the treatment of COVID-19. However, this is one of the, let's say, conspiracy theories, one of fakes, which is around, which is circulating around. Then, of course, COVID-19 preventive measures, and sometimes around media, especially when the first lockdown took place, they said that for example, it's better to wash your hands for many times rather than wearing gloves, actually, in some public places, etc. So, and of course, something which is really topical and hot for today is COVID-19 vaccination and a number of conspiracy theories around it. For example, one of that Pfizer vaccine. So if you're vaccinated with Pfizer, then it can change it, or it can change your DNA, the structure of your DNA. Or if you're vaccinated also with one of the vaccines, then it means that some microchip can be inserted into your body. Of course, these conspiracy theories, yes, they circulate around the again, physical, technological, etc. environments as media, and they take this. They cause panic. They cause psychological disorders and many negative consequences. So why we can say again that COVID-19 is conspiracy theories are transmedia viruses, because they really circulate around various platforms, again, social media, then some websites, then some YouTube channels, which provide information about conspiracy theories from different perspectives. So, and continuing this topic, it's possible to say, right, as you can see presented in one of the recent books by about representation of media and conspiracy theories, in particular about COVID-19. And it says that actually COVID-19 turned into, on the one hand, public health challenge and the biggest global story of the 21st century. So COVID-19 conspiracy theories, yes, they are transmedia viruses on the one hand, because they pollute the environment of the internet and physical environment, actually shaping our minds, changing our, again, mindset and our behavior in a certain way. And they can be also treated as multimodal construals, because the conspiracy theories information is presented, is packed in the integration of various modes, as we could see, for example, on the first examples where meta-COVID metaphors were presented, right? It's both verbal and visual in integration. Of course, which enhances the desired effect. So, as I have already mentioned, yes, COVID-19 conspiracy theories as transmedia viruses, they circulate, as Lance Strate puts it, in symbolic environment, yes, in language, and of course, various other codes, there's other forms of art, kinds of art. They circulate in technological environment, yes, social media, etc., TV, and other options that the virtual environment has to suggest us, and of course biophysical environment. So talking about a symbolic environment, also I would provide just a quick example, yeah, of viral poetry, yes, except for various media articles about various aspects of COVID, yes, with disinformation and actual information. There appeared, and also academic articles, right, research on COVID-19 from various perspectives. There appeared a lot of actually examples of poetry and even ballet and many other representations of COVID-19. So including actually conceptualizations of conspiracy theories as well. But I would say that if we compare this conceptualization or manifestation of COVID-19 in symbolic environment and in technological environment, then in symbolic environment, in the environment of art, if we take this perspective, it is rather, it is about helping people to overcome psychological difficulties and actually physical difficulties that they encounter in the times of COVID-19. So it means that not just professional poets, of course, write books of poetry or dance or whatever. So just usual people, so they resort to poetry or any other kinds of art in order to again, to express their feelings, to experience it through various media in integration of various modes. And one of the examples which could be considered as together as COVID being constructed via symbolic media environment, or medium, and in cooperation kind of with technological medium is a project suggested, kind of the social project suggested by two universities, and they have they have actually composed a poem, global community poem about COVID-19 vaccination, and by means of this COVID, they motivate people to actually to get vaccinated. So this is just a fragment from the poem, and they invite people also, anyone could just write a poetry on, so a piece of poetry on vaccination, again, expressing their attitude towards this topic, and of course motivating other people to get vaccinated, and thus actually saving their lives and not being infected, etc. Okay, so just to sum it all up, again, I would say that transmedia COVID-19 conspiracy theories, they are transmedia viruses, which, let's say, pollute and circulate around various environments, various media being environments. They are multimodal construals because they create these media in integration of visual, verbal, audio, etc., auditory, semiotic resources. And on the one hand, these conspiracy theories as transmedia viruses, they have negative consequences, absolutely, and they shape people's minds within the pandemic situation in a negative, panic, and again, psychologically harmful way. On the other hand, when people strive for getting some actual information, transmedia conspiracy theories as transmedia viruses, they can act, they can be presented as some boosters for actually sorting out matters, for clearing up this situation. And actually, in this regard, this art pieces, poetic pieces being symbolic environments, yes, they help in that. So that's actually it. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you very much. It was really marvelous. And I think it's really something that is vital for us. We quite understand this topic, and now we're open for discussion. Questions? Yeah, Nazar. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Olena, for your splendid speech, your report. I would like to pose you a question concerning some parallels between different historical traumas and their overcoming. Yeah, we can say that COVID-19 already constitutes a kind of historical trauma, global collective trauma. We had similar traumas in the previous history. Most of all, they were wars. Yeah, and are there any parallels in overcoming post-war traumatic experiences and COVID-19 traumatic experience? Thank you very much for your answer. I would be very eager to hear it.
Okay, Nazar, thanks a lot for your question. Yeah, that's definitely so that COVID-19 is a trauma, right? And it has its influence, it has already had its influence on the one hand on the landscape of the academic world, right, as we can see it. And on the other hand, it has already, I think, entrenched its actions, its consequences into our mind. So is it possible to draw any parallels in terms of historical trauma? Yes, and post-war kind of post-war rehabilitation probably, or something like that. I would answer in the following way, that first of all, it will be art, which I believe in that really. It will be art which we really need which we really resort to in the times of need. And we know very well from psychological perspective, yes, there's an art therapy, right? So where you can, if you can cope, right, with your traumatic feelings with the help of, actually drawing pictures, or I don't know, maybe someone composing music, maybe poetry, etc. On the other hand, of course, I understand that I think many people need professional professional assistance, right, of psychologists, right, in overcoming some COVID-19 COVID-19 problems, psychological consequences, I would say. And the first of it is, I think that we are all kind of locked in. On the one hand, right, this global world, actually, it caused what has happened with us, right? And the world has become actually anti-global on the one hand, right? Especially in the very beginning of the COVID-19. So when all the borders were sealed, absolutely. So now it's a little bit better, right? But okay, so first this lockdown, right? This immobility in various perspectives. Of course, I'm sure that not all people are quite strong, right, to survive that psychologically. So I think to help that, two ways: either art therapy or professional assistance. Okay, like that.
Thank you very much.
Dear Lance, yeah, please, a question.
Thanks. Great talk. I really enjoyed it. It was nice to see you mention my friend Doug Rushkoff, who often participates in with the MEA. And of course, when he coined the phrase media virus, he was sort of finding a popular expression for that term meme that Richard Dawkins, the biologist, created. And when he did that, I mean, he was a biologist, you know, didn't really know what he was doing. They just said that here's a parallel to the idea of gene, that genes are self-replicating bits of DNA, and that there are ideas that replicate by just going from one person's brain to another. They're reproducing in the way that genes, or as you say, viruses reproduce. But what he missed about that was that genes are not just I mean, they are logical expressions, but they're based on a chemical reality, on the DNA molecule. And memes also, you know, what we're talking about there is defined and constrained by the technology, the medium that's being used. And in fact, Dawkins' idea sat unused for about 20 years. But then when the internet came along, it suddenly exploded, because when somebody sent an email and that got forwarded to 10 people, and those 10 people forwarded it to 10 more people, and then eventually it came back, and you could see more so back in those days, the history of all the people that the email had been forwarded to. And, you know, you could actually see the spread of ideas. And so the word meme or virus, you know, was used to try to represent that idea of the spread of the diffusion of information over the internet. And so I think it's very important to always, you know, recall that it is tied to a particular mode, if you like, or medium of communication. The same thing with poetry. It's totally different in oral cultures. There, Eric Havelock called it the tribal encyclopedia. It's not distinct from song. It becomes an art form only in literate cultures. And then, I mean, I was part of a poetry community on MySpace, and, you know, we played around with, you know, blogging poetry becomes different from publishing poetry. Doing it on Twitter, 140 character poems, you know, it becomes a new form. But I did want to say that, you know, in terms of the conspiracy stuff, which is such a horror for us here in the US, but it made me think of, you know, first of all, there's a long-standing study of rumor. which has mostly been about oral transmission, although extended by the telephone, for example. But it made me think of, there was a book some years, decades ago, called Improvised News by Tommaso Shibutani. And she looked at the aftermath of Hiroshima, the survivors, and they had no idea what happened. And, the idea was that in the absence of information, rumor abounds. That people try to make sense of what's going on. And your talk, Elena, made me think that we're actually at the opposite end of the spectrum now, where one of the big problems with the current media environment, and we say media environment, we have all the different technologies, is too much information. And we've been saying that for a long time, information overload. And so with the overabundance of information, the overload, and the breakdown of filters, gatekeepers, barriers that comes with it, we reach the other end of the spectrum that also leads to rumors that there's no way for many people to tell what is true and what isn't, because it's all just out there in a jumble, and all competing, all denigrating the other sources. And so our ability to form coherent pictures for many people, coherent senses of reality, breaks down, which I think it was Harold Innis, actually suggested that at that point, societies break down, which we may be witnessing. I mean, we seem to be teetering in some ways.
Yeah, Lance, thanks a lot actually for your comments. Yeah, I was really very, very careful about media ecology, because generally speaking, yeah, I can't say that this is the field of study I'm completely in, right? But I was absolutely happy to actually to get to know about it, right? And actually to read some of the sources and to listen to your presentations like online again. And of course, today I have an absolutely different feeling, because even if our communication today is mediated, right, via Zoom, so anyway, it is kind of so alive, personal. I mean, when you speak here and now and address to us directly rather than in some distant time. And I was trying to actually make an attempt to combine. I understand that it takes and it will take more time for doing that on solid grounds, right, more profoundly. So to combine kind of your treatment of, again, some terms, yes, some key concepts in media ecology, yes, as media itself as an environment, right? And some things from, for example, multimodality studies. And I really loved this idea, as an academic, generally speaking, it is absolutely transparent, the idea of medium being an environment. It is an environment, right, which is, but okay, so my perception here, environment which is created by semiotic resources being modes. So this is kind of their interaction. And on the other hand, right, if we approach that from the perspective, again, of ecological studies, right, ecolinguistics, so then environment, right, and resources which shape our mind in a certain way, right, they can either pollute this environment, right, as it is with, as you say, or viruses are spread, they can be either polluted or vice versa. There can be some other means, some other modes, right, which vice versa prompts or help us kind of to clean up those environments. So the idea kind of that. And I absolutely agree with you about medium being so that actually what and how is presented, I mean, some information, some knowledge, maybe conspiracy theories, maybe some, so just images or whatever about COVID-19 or any other phenomena. So I absolutely agree that the way it is presented and the way it influences the audience is how this or that environment, what the structure of environment is, how it is structured. And you have mentioned about poetry. You're absolutely right. Yes, I have researched poetry, American poetry mostly, flower poetry, so a poetry of search engines and many things like that. Of course, it is something, it already has its tradition, right? But the media, right, or the medium where this poetry is created or has been created, really it influences our perception and it influences our behavior as well. Yeah, and absolutely. Thank you for explaining about media virus. Yes, and actually Rashkov. Yeah. So when I came across this term, yes, of course I've read some information. I was trying to understand, right, what it really means. Yes, about media virus. So I was happy that I could apply. Of course, I will study it further on and probably write an article or whatever. Yeah, in terms of transmedia and the theory of transmediality. Yes, so this spread of viruses, right? It can be explained by this transmediality. So a lot of media across various media where the content circulates, etc. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Sure. And I'm sorry, but I do have to go. I have another Zoom coming up right now. So I want to say thank you very much. I hope we can continue this dialogue, and I hope that we can do this in person at some time, before too long. So,
I hope so. Maybe you'll come to Ukraine once. Yeah, I hope so. And anyway, we will cooperate, I think, within the maybe Institute of General Semantics. I think that would be interesting for our group.
We would be very, very happy to cooperate on things. So, so
thanks a lot.
And take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Thank you very much. And to all the participants, we're really grateful for taking part.
It was incredible. Yeah.
In our discussion. Yeah, it took some time, but anyway, we're so happy to talk about this really innovative topics. And I think that's a great implication of our theories and thoughts actually in the real topics with the empirical materials. And these are the first perhaps investigations, and we actually have a look like what can we do actually with different investigations, how we can implement our media ecology theory. Yeah, Vitaly.
No, I just wanted to say that it was amazing, and I think that we've managed to break some ground here, and I hope that it's just the beginning of something bigger.
So thanks a lot for all who took part in this discussion and conversation, who have listened to our talks and discussions, and I think we have some more time to think it over. Are there any other comments on what has been already said before we actually will leave?
Just a great thanks to organizers for this wonderful webinar. Absolutely, this is really incredible, and I understand that we have a lot of food for our thought. So, thank you.
Okay, we'll think it over, and I think we really need time for that. Thank you very much, Igor.
Thank you to all speakers.
So I think that's all for today, and we're waiting for our next webinars, which are following, I think. And Thanks a lot. I hope to see some of you at the next webinars in our research group. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank
That's
you.
all for
Thank
today.
you. Bye-bye. Have a good
Bye.
weekend.
Bye.
Thanks a
Bye.
lot.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.